Slides, jumps, and dashes. All of them are different forms of movement, a key part to the experience when you're playing a game. And understandably so, they're the glue that makes games move forward. But what about these systems make a game work? And why is it that when a game knocks them out of the park, it feels so much better than others? I'm Ryan, and in this week's Rhyno Project, I wanted to give you a rundown of movement systems and finally give my thoughts on why they are so crucial to gaming. And before we get into it, I want you to leave a comment letting me know what games have the best movement systems and why. Also, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It really helps me out and lets me know you want to see more videos like this. Most games nowadays have some form of movement. We've moved away from the systems of point-and-click games to more interactive experiences. And while it's still a challenge to get someone new to gaming to understand the concept of an analog stick, anyone who has played games nowadays has a basic understanding of how to traverse the world in games. When you look at movement in games, there are a few key points in history that impacted how we perceive moving a character. While most of us have played games like Pacman, which featured 4 directions of movement, utilizing the D-pad, gaming as a whole was locked into relatively stiff motions for a while. See, the directional pad, or D-pad for short, has limits to how you can move a character. The inputs can be broken down into primary directions and secondary directions. Let's kick it off with the primary directions of inputs. You can move left or right, and up and down with inputs on either side of the D-pad. Alternatively, you can move in an extra 4 directions by combining the inputs from the up and down directions, opening up the possibilities to move in 8 different directions. The D-pad has been one of the biggest advancements in gaming, opening up the possibilities of games beyond what was initially possible. But as time went on, the limitations of the D-pad began to show up, especially when games started to make it more of a push towards 3D graphics. But then came along a new style of control, and with that, the possibilities were endless. In 1988, the Nes Max was released. This controller was one of the first of its kind, featuring a thumb pad instead of the traditional D-pad. And although it gave the feeling of 360-degree inputs, the limitation was the NES, which only registered directional inputs we talked about beforehand. Although this controller was limited, it paved the way in analog sticks and gave many their first taste into the future of gaming. Only a year later, the XE-1 AP was released for the Sega Mega Drive, a controller that looked as close to an alien as its name. It was the first controller with an analog stick as we've come to know it as today. With its limited release though, we never saw the full possibilities of its movement at the time. We really saw the analog stick take storm with the Nintendo 64. This was the first time we saw a controller that could utilize the complete movement possibilities of an analog stick. You could angle the stick in any direction, and with 3D platformers taking the world by storm, this new control scheme was introduced with limitless possibilities that came with these new movements. Analog sticks were on every controller you could find, mimicking the style of inputs from arcade cabinets in the palm of your hand. Developers started to create new ways to control your character. Games like Mario 64, Spyro, and Banjo-Kazooie were all games that utilized this style of movement, in addition to adding their own flair to them. Mario was able to jump in any direction, adding things like long jumps, dives, and double jumps to his arsenal, all of which created the ability to traverse levels in different ways. Speedrunners have pushed these systems to their limits, all the while lowering the time to beat the game to just under an hour and 40 minutes. That amount of skill relies on an insane understanding of mechanics and movement possibilities. Once you understand those systems for movement, the challenge comes from understanding how you can utilize them in creative ways and how you can break them. Using these different systems is what truly makes a game feel great. You can start looking at maneuvers that would have been impossible before. One of my favorite examples of breaking movement systems has to come from Half-Life 2. Utilizing a mechanic called accelerated backwards hopping, Valve used a system to cap speed in Half-Life that would prevent bunny hopping by giving the player speed backwards whenever the player was going too fast, assuming that the player would be moving forward whenever this happens. But by utilizing clever movement, a player can gain that initial momentum and whip around, bunny hopping backwards. You might see where I'm going with this. Because of this added speed in the backwards direction, players have learned how to utilize this to their advantage, bypassing the speed limit that you would normally hit by bunny hopping, giving Freeman enough speed to transcend the laws of nature and practically gaining wings like he just chugged a case of Red Bull. When a developer creates engaging mechanics to get around these areas, the game feels fluid. You'll get a sense of enjoyment just from moving around the game. Titanfall 2 has an extremely fun section that has become notorious for speedrunners. The Gauntlet is part of the first level of Titanfall 2. This section is a timed run where you utilize all of the movement tech that you learned from the tutorial. The community has made this into an amazing test of skill. Through the section, you're wall running, sliding, and jumping through obstacles to get to the finish as fast as possible. At least, that's how they plan for you to complete it. Over the years, the Gauntlet has been a place for players to showcase their different movement abilities, and race each other for the fastest times on the leaderboard. The level of finesse that players like Cash Mayo, Whatever Shoe, and Zetriox have shows that Titanfall 2's Gauntlet can be finished faster than my first relationship. Things like grenade boosts allow players to speed through the Gauntlet by propelling themselves forward with explosions. Because they understand how to use movement to their advantage, they can continue to push the time lower than ever on the leaderboards. These tricks ended up being the inspiration for Octane, who tried launching himself through the Gauntlet with a grenade, simultaneously blowing his legs off in the process. But movement isn't just important for speedrunners, though. When a developer is creating the movement system for a game, the line between what feels good and what is accurate tends to get blurred. For example, jumping in video games is heavily altered from what's possible in real life. You've got things like double jumps that allow the player to propel themselves mid-air through sheer willpower. And no matter how much Taco Bell you eat, the gas from it won't launch you in the air like a Ryu player spamming Shoryuken. Developers aim to make controlling a character as enjoyable as possible, often forgoing what would be accurate in life in favor of making an otherwise dull mechanic feel fun. Movement is the backbone of modern gaming. Without the proper systems in place, playing games like Need for Speed or Rocket League would be out the window. Drifting in that tricked out AE86 would be left to your dreams. Same thing with getting the perfect flip reset on Rocket League. You wouldn't be able to make these advanced maneuvers if the game felt too stiff to control. This is what makes games like Fallout or Sea of Thieves tedious to traverse. You're left with very few ways of getting around the world. Most developers try to remedy this by giving the ability to sprint, and that might have been enough years ago, but it's 2021 and games have come a long way from things like Pacman and tank controls of Resident Evil. When you play a game like Dying Light for a while, you become accustomed to things like vaulting and jumping from building to building. And going back to a game that doesn't have these movement options, you start to feel as though you're running around with munchlax tied to your waist. You start to fantasize about what it would be like if more games adopted this approach. Jumping from your ship on Sea of Thieves, sliding down the sails and boarding that sloop that picked a fight with a galleon, or what it would be like running along a wall, jumping off it and mounting a Rathian in Monster Hunter. This video isn't made just to complain about movement. I made this to show just how crucial it is to create systems beyond the typical options of sprinting and jumping in games. When a developer goes out their way to make something as simple as moving around fun, it does far more than just giving players a faster way to get from point A to point B. It opens a world of possibilities for players to explore and master the different ways to traverse the world. Ultimately, it creates a system that players can learn and figure out over time, opening the door for players to keep playing years after release. And that is leaps and bounds beyond what most games can offer to their communities. And all it takes is that first step. This video was a blast to make. I really hope you enjoyed this topic as much as I did getting to talk about it. Don't forget to let me know in the comments what your favorite game with movement systems are. And if you haven't, please consider subscribing and liking the video so you can stay up to date anytime I release stuff like this. Also, don't forget to check out the rest of the Rhyno Project, where every week I take on a different project or idea and share what I learn with you. Thank you again for watching the video, and as always, have a good one. Peace.
Feeling like I should, I'm all good, I'm all good. Never knew I could, I'm all good, I'm all good. Feeling like I should.